Thank you, Jeff. All right, everybody, welcome to the Wednesday, July 24th, Lawrence Douglas County Planning Commission meeting. To go over the rules of the hybrid meeting, I'm going to turn it over to Will.
My name is Will Mansfield, planner, and I'll be helping to facilitate the Zoom video portion of the meeting. We'll work alongside the chair to facilitate the meeting's proceedings. I have a few housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to me. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. When you are participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send a chat to me. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. And now I'll turn the meeting back over to the chair.
Thank you, Will. Jeff, do we have any written communications from the public?
All the communications that were received by the deadline were included as part of your packet.
Thank you. Any communications from staff, commissioners, or other commissioners?
None this evening.
Okay. How about any waiver requests or determinations made by the city engineer?
Also none this evening.
Any disclosure of ex parte communication among the commissioners?
I'll just say that I attended the steering committee meeting, and exiting, I chatted with my neighbor about it, but it was nothing that's not already in our packet.
Thank you. Thank you. Any abstentions? We were not going to vote, so I don't think we need to ask, but, you know. And then now it's time for general public comment. So today we're going to be talking about the Land Development Code updates. Is there anybody in the room that wants to talk about something other than the Land Development Code? You have something, sir? We'll do that when we start that item. Okay. So is that for the Land Development Code, Becky?
For the Land Development Code. Is that what you're talking about? I thought I don't care whichever better. It's under the Land Development Code.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. We'll come back to you. Sure. We'll make sure to come back to you. And okay, so just to go over what it's going to be, how it's going to work today. So we're going to start with Elizabeth's presentation on the Land Development Code. The final draft has been published, so she's going to kind of walk us through what that looks like. We're specifically today talking about section, is it 16? Section 16, administrative and procedural. Did I say that right?
Bring it up on what it's called. Administration
and procedures. Okay.
16.
And after Elizabeth presents, I'm going to ask if the commission has any questions. We're going to try to not exhaust our questions because I want the public. There are several people in the room, so once we have some preliminary questions asked, I want to turn it back over for public comment. Each person will have 3 minutes. And then we'll bring it back to the commission once we've had the public have a chance to say their 3 minutes each. So that's where we're going to go. Elizabeth, Jeff, did I capture that? Sounds okay to you?
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth, if you're ready, please go ahead. And then after you're done, we'll see if we can get some questions from the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and commission members. I have a fairly short PowerPoint this evening, so we'll go ahead and do that. And then go back to commissioner questions and public comment. Oops, hold on. All right. So this evening we're doing administration and procedures. We're going to do a presentation, overview presentation, and talk about some of the updates and changes. And then we do have a paired set of questions that came out of the neighborhood input that we just completed that we'd like to share with Planning Commission for consideration, and we'll go from there. So just as a reminder to everybody, the project goals for the Land Development Code update were to identify opportunities to meet city goals, including Plan 2040 and applicable plans, to create more predictable development outcomes, to simplify and streamline development procedures, and to make the Land Development Code more user-friendly. So here's our schedule project schedule. You'll note that our project schedule went through June, and we're in July, which is just about right for a land development code project. And we have some extended schedule dates. Planning Commission, we were able to talk about this a couple weeks ago, and this is up on the project website. We are, the consultant team is following this schedule unless we are guided otherwise by the Planning Commission. So this evening we'll do administration and procedures. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the content that we'll cover at the August 14th mid-month meeting. So just for the members of the public that may be watching us or in the room this evening, we want to let everybody know that as the Planning Commission chairperson just told us, there is an adoption version of the Land Development Code on the project website. And the project website address is available on the bottom of the screen. And so this draft will be on the website from July through late September as Planning Commission goes through a multi-meeting process to review and discuss it. It is open for public comments during that entire time frame. This version will not be revised until the completion of the Planning Commission review schedule. Proposed changes, should they come out of Planning Commission discussion or Steering Commission discussion, will be posted on the project website for public review. And just a little more information, if you go to the website, you are going to go to the documents page and you're going to look for this notice, Adoption Review Draft. If you click on the red bar below that, you land on the version of the document that you can comment on. So just to let everybody know, this is what you're looking for. You can scroll through this document and put a bubble in it to leave a comment. And those comments will be collected and reviewed by the consultant team and staff and shared as is with the community so everybody can see what the comments are. And to be clear, you can see the comments in the document, but we will also pull them out and share them. Okay, so diving into our topic this evening, administration and procedures, we will focus primarily on Article 16. There are a few other articles that fall into this category. There's a little bit of content in Article 1, general provisions, that's procedural. We'll cover very briefly Articles 17, 18, and 19, nonconformities and violation and enforcement. Those sections were primarily carried forward from the current regulations, particularly violations and enforcement, which is mostly statutory, and so the code doesn't have a huge impact on that. And measurements and definitions have gotten updated with each round of drafting, and so there's a little bit on that, not a lot this evening. So the focus of the changes in the procedural sections were to improve process clarity, help improve applicant understanding, and allow applicants to do some self-help. Sometimes we want to just have an expectation of what might happen next in a process. And so the goal of changing the procedures was to better explain what goes on through the procedural process. We wanted to describe all of the general review procedures and all of the steps in specific processes, again, just so an applicant can know what to expect. And also, so if questions come up in the process, there are clear rules and expectations about how to handle what could happen in terms of processing an application. We looked through the regulations to either establish or update review criteria for all specific procedures. This helps an applicant understand what the city expects of them, and it also helps, it helps neighbors or others who are following an application know what that application will be reviewed against. We eliminated explicit or implicit criteria related to density. We thought that those were not as relevant to what the city is up to now, and didn't want to leave a message that it is okay to change density away from that's required in the code and that is established in Plan 2040. And then finally, we established clear timeframes for lapsing of applications. So incomplete applications or complete applications on which there's no progress don't sit unused for future confusion. And then we clarified the process for extension. So the goal there was just to make sure that everybody knows what the timeframes are and how to ask for help if they need it. So Article 1, the general provisions, here you have a clip from the table of contents, just so you can see everything that's in this article. It is primarily the background legal content of the Land Development Code. So it cites the authority from state statute and from home rule that the city has to regulate property. It cites what the code is applicable to, what the purposes are. We have descriptions of how the city works with minimum standards and conflicting provisions. So how does the city interpret these regulations against something that might happen in fire code? Or how does the city interpret the land development code with private agreements or covenants? There is a section on what happens during a local emergency. Section 2107, the city can and has established fees, charges, and how to cover expenses. 2108 may be important for the next year or so. It talks about how applications that are already in the city's pipeline will be handled in transitioning from the current code to the new code, and also about how applications or approvals that have a second round approval are handled. So if a preliminary plat was approved under the existing regulations and then the city adopts new regulations, how is the final plat approved? So this is really primarily background instructions to provide clarity for people using the code. So then we go on to I wanted to highlight the purposes. These are at the front end of the code. So this is in Article 1. And the LDC is intended to implement the Lawrence Douglas County Comprehensive Plan. And so these are all of the purposes that this code is intended to implement. And I'm pointing this out early in the process because I'm sure over the next couple months as we go through this, we'll have questions about why did you make this change or what does this regulation do? And so this is kind of our guidelines that we work with in addition to the plan. And this is kind of consolidated down from Plan 2040, some of the other city plans and best practices for code drafting. So we move into administration and procedures. So this is all of Article 16. There's a lot of content here, and I want to jump ahead in the presentation and let everybody know there's not a lot of change from the current regulations in this section. It is simply built out a little more completely. So we added content or completed content to let readers understand what is happening in these different procedures. So you can see this is organized in terms of what is the role and authority of the review and decision-making bodies in the city. What is the summary of the procedures that the city has available that an applicant might use? What are the general review procedures? So this 2016-03, these are the things that could be applicable across multiple types of applications. So how does a pre-application conference work, for example? That could take place in a variety of different applications. Or what happens if you complete your application and you want to withdraw it? So that might be a change status. So this just goes through the basics of how we procedurally take an application from filing through the decision-making process, and a little beyond that. What happens if somebody isn't completing what they're supposed to be doing with the application? What happens if the city needs to put a guarantee or a performance agreement in place? So this is intended to cover that entire process. The procedures themselves are split into two sets of content related to how an applicant might understand using them. So that first set of procedures are things that require a city commission or a Board of Zoning Appeals decision. And then the second group, and so those are going to get a public meeting or a public hearing. The second group is specific procedures without a public hearing. So these are administrative procedures. And then finally, we have the required plans and studies, which after doing more cleanup across the code, we're down to the retail market impact analysis, which Planning Commission has discussed, and we can return to this evening if need be. So moving on to the next slide. Just to show some of the content. So there is more summary information in this version. So tables similar to this table explaining to an applicant or for use in a discussion with an applicant, if you are applying for, an appeal of an administrative decision, what section do you find that information in? Do you have to have a pre-application meeting? And who is the review and decision-making body? So we move into the last few sections here, nonconformities. So just for everybody's understanding, a nonconformity is a use or a structure or piece of property that was legal, was established legally pursuant to the regulations that are in place right now or a prior code, and has continued in use or is still, being lived in or whatever's going on. And for some reason, it has fallen out of compliance with the code. There's something going on with the use or the structure or the lot that doesn't meet the requirements of this code. And so what this section says is the city doesn't require anybody to stop the use or take down the structure in the land development code. It's allowed to keep going. And there are a few rules around expanding it or changing it when it might need to be brought into compliance with this code. So this is a section that we don't spend a lot of time on. It can be fairly important in terms of a code update because one of the things we want to do is let people know that the home they have or the building they have or the business they have, even if there is something in this code that says that building is not allowed in this zoning district under this code, or that use is not allowed in the zoning district under this code, it is still allowed to stay. Nobody will be asked to scrape down their house or take down their business under the land development code. I do have to clarify on the side, if there are building code issues, that's a different discussion. So an unsafe structure is not protected by the nonconformity provisions, but that's a different issue. So sometimes as we put a new code in place, we feel, people feel concerned, what does it mean? I don't see that I can do what I'm doing. It's okay. This section lets people keep doing what they're doing. For the most part, as we drafted the new regulations, we were concerned that we weren't creating nonconformities. So the goal was not to say, oh, you're okay because you're protected under this. The goal is to say you're okay because you're allowed under the code. And so that was a general code drafting rule. This is here as backup. So then we move on to violations and enforcement. So this is Article 18. It speaks to the city's responsibilities and authority in terms of enforcement. The city has a code enforcement team that is doing their work, and this is a piece of that. This also speaks to the legal authority of the city to step in with civil action or criminal action, depending on what's going on. And then finally, we have measurements and definitions. These are helpful across the code. We have a section in here telling people how to interpret the code. This is useful for when something seems to be confusing, or more often than the text seems to be confusing, people come to it with different interpretations. This gives a list of basic interpretations. And then there are a set of common measurements here, how the city will measure building coverage or building height or floor area. These common measurements are important to project reviews, and we want applicants, code users, to be able to understand how the city works in terms of measurements. And then finally, following this, is an entire set of definitions organized alphabetically. So I'm going to go into some of the changes across the board in these sections. So as I stopped on earlier, we updated the transitional provisions. And so this is transition from old code to new code. And we added those specific rules for multi-step processes. So preliminary plat under the old code, final plat under the new code. The code tells you how to process that. In multiple sections, as I highlighted a minute ago, we deleted the language about decision-making bodies not being required to approve the maximum density or intensity of the use. it is preferential for the decision-making bodies to look at the project as a whole and not single out density as a decision point. And so there are still review criteria in there, but not as focused on density, more focused on the overall impact of the project. In section 2016-03, we simplified the process to extend an approval if a project has been delayed for some reason. So wanting it to be easy for an applicant to request an extension administratively. And then in 3 sections, we reviewed and slightly amended the review criteria to improve clarity about the city's project expectations. Those review criteria really should be used to let an applicant know what the application will be reviewed against as it comes through the city process. So we wanted to make sure that the code was clear in those areas. Some additional changes. We added an administrative adjustment process, and this allows measurable adjustments to measurable standards pre or post approval without requiring a variance. We know that when someone is doing a development, be that, a homeowner on their own lot or someone who's doing a larger development, sometimes because of the lot itself or something else is going on in the lot, it's necessary to get a small adjustment. And this section allows just that, a small adjustment without requiring a variance. It also includes some language that clarifies how the city goes through the process of doing Fair Housing Act accommodations or a RLUIPA, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, substantial burden adjustments. So just clarifying those. You might see a couple new things in there, a few new references. After working with MSO, we added a reference to the erosion and sediment control plan that MSO does, just to let applicants know that there are situations where they'll be required to do this. We added a new process for a grading permit. So this happens at the beginning of construction prior to site grading. And then we also cross-referenced the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, SWP3 requirements, overall development process. So we were looking to get more comprehensive with that list of things that an applicant might be required to submit. So those are things that have changed. Some things have been updated. We consolidated all the general review procedures and updated them for completeness. So back on the table of contents, when I said this set of procedures could be applicable to any type of application, they were described in different levels of detail in different parts of the regulations. And what we did was we cleaned them up, put them all in one place so you can go start to finish on that. Partial steps or repetitive steps were removed because we didn't want to leave conflicts in the code. And so now we have a full set of shared rules for the city staff and for applicants. We also did some revisions to the plan development process for clarity and in keeping with the changes that we've made in the zoning district set of the code. A few more updates. The land development code interpretation process was updated for completeness. The whole process wasn't fully explained. So it includes new standards for PUD interpretation, clarifies that new uses can be interpreted into the code, and the air quotes are just, acknowledging that, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, there's probably going to be a use that somebody wants to do that we didn't think about at this point in time. And so this allows those to be interpreted into the code with instructions about how to do that. So the goal of these two changes is to simplify those processes and to determine whether specific provisions are applicable to proposed development or development changes. Also in the site plan process, working with staff who was already working on this process, we've streamlined and updated site plan in terms of consolidating from 3 types of site plan to 2. So now there's standard site plan and major site plan. Identifying the criteria for the appropriate category that a development would come in through. So how do we know if it's a standard application? How do we know if it's a major application? And again, in this process of updating, we're looking to clarify for applicants and speed up the process so we don't end up going, well, it could be this or it could be this. We want to really get tied in on that identification so someone can continue forward with their application. So we also wanted to point out, and this is particularly important in the procedural section, what has stayed the same, or what hasn't changed. And so in terms of procedures, all of the major processes have stayed the same. So if someone needs to do a rezoning, same thing. If they need to do site plan, we've consolidated, but there's still a site plan process. One thing I didn't touch on this evening is subdivision procedures. In the previous draft, we did not include all of the procedures in the joint city-county subdivision regulations. They've all been incorporated into this draft, and the subdivision procedures are unchanged. So they're here and they're carried forward. The review and decision-making bodies can still keep their same roles. The rezoning review criteria still follows the state golden criteria requirement. I'm sorry, I did have on bullet 4 that the subdivision procedures are carried forward and kept the same. The non-conformities are pretty much the same, 98% the same as they were in the current code, with the addition of regulations to deal with non-conforming site features. So as the city sees more redevelopment, we might sometimes find that landscaping is non-conforming or outdoor lighting is non-conforming. So that category of not a structure, not a use is encompassed in site features. And then finally, there were no changes to the violations and enforcement section. So on the whole, we are carrying forward the city's procedures with cleanup edits and clarification edits. So let's just do a little bit of content overview. So we've got, whoops, I'm sorry, I apologize to everyone. I left that slide in the wrong location. That was the entirety of the overview presentation. And my next slide is an update of the questions that have come to us from the public that we wanted to share with Planning Commission for review. So I'm going to stop a second and see if you guys want to instruct me to back up or go forward.
You have an opinion?
Nope.
Just keep going? Just keep going, Elizabeth, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to walk through this. We received 2 requests from LAN at the neighborhood meetings, the Lawrence Association of Neighborhoods, and they read together in terms of how we look at the code. And this is about administrative approvals for residential projects. So under the current code and under the new code, residential projects that have 1 or 2 units are approved administratively. So a single family detached or duplex development goes through site plan review and is usually not sufficient to trigger the kind of notice of everyone in the neighborhood knowing what's going on and a neighborhood meeting about those projects. So LAN wanted to provide notice for those residential projects. And so that's the front end comment. The back end comment is they requested extended time to file an appeal of administrative determination. So whatever the city PDS staff decides about that application right now needs to be appealed in 9 days. And I believe the request for appeal was to 30 days. I will tell you all in other meetings with neighborhood members across different neighborhoods, we heard a similar request, and that was a request for more along the lines of a 14-day extension, not a full 30-day extension. So to put this in context, what does it impact? So administrative approvals such as site plan or other administrative determinations can be appealed to the Board of Zoning Appeals. The Board of Zoning Appeals scope of review, what they're supposed to be looking at is whether the administrative official erred in making their decision. It's not the same as the Board of Zoning Appeals is the sort of the second bite at the apple. So if I don't like the staff's administrative decision, I don't get to go see if the Board of Zoning Appeals will come up with a different decision. They are supposed to be reviewing to see if that administrative decision was in error based on the regulations or the scope of authority. The appeal process stops that administrative approval from taking effect. So while it's on appeal, no one is moving forward with the project. So considerations from the consultant's point of view, and this is we're putting this out for Planning Commission discussion. The appeal takes place at the end of the project, at the end of the project application, and this is extending the time frame and cost for the applicant. We understand that the neighbors would like to know what's going on with the project. They may want to appeal the decision. But the reasons we heard for extending that time frame were we might not be available to do it. It could be that we have to scramble to get that appeal done. And that tells us, the consultant team, that it's because this is possibly new information for the neighborhood. So one of the things we're putting out there for Planning Commission discussion is it may be more effective to require the applicant to provide a minimal amount of notice to the neighbors or the neighborhood association when the application is filed. So early in the process, let the neighbors know what's going on. Maybe that's simply mailed notice to the adjoining lots and the applicable neighborhood association, not the same as a rezoning. Just in terms of explanation to Planning Commission, we also heard a request to allow public comment or a public hearing process for floodplain permits. Those are also approved administratively. And we heard a request to allow, to provide review or notice of MSO waivers, so that could be sidewalk waivers or parking waivers, to neighboring properties and or to the neighborhood. So the comments that we've received over the last month or so in terms of the process are primarily related to what do people know and when do they know it. So then finally, rounding out the presentation, at the next meeting, at the mid-month meeting, we will be teeing up mobility and connectivity. So this will be a discussion about street connectivity, pedestrian circulation, sidewalks, and on-site pedestrian connections, bicycle circulation, safe on-site bicycle connections, and compliance with the Lawrence Bike Plan. So we just wanted to let everyone know, and we can come back to this slide later in case they're prepping for that. And that's the end of the presentation tonight. So I will stop and follow where you guys want to go for discussion.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm going to bring it back to the commission, and this is a chance for us to ask any clarifying questions of Elizabeth. I don't want us to engage in discussion until we've had the public give their 3 minutes each. So do we have anything we want to get clarification on from Elizabeth? You know, questions from anybody in the commission that wasn't clear on what she said, or?
I have one. Elizabeth, I'm a little bit puzzled because, thank you. I'm a little puzzled because I thought that the draft that was posted today was going to be called the Land Development Code Final Draft, and that's not the name of the one we're looking at. So does that mean there is yet to be a final draft for our consideration?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner Aldrich. No, we named it the adoption review draft, but it is the last thing. It is the final draft. We wanted to let everybody know it was going into adoption. So this is the last version. Changes to this version will be in the form of Planning Commission recommendation or Steering Committee recommendation. So that won't happen until after you all have had an opportunity to go through the set of hearings and discussions that we'll be doing. So I apologize if that created confusion for you, but this is it. No intention to do a final or final or anything along those lines.
Great. Thank you.
Yes.
And then the other question I had was, can we have copies of your PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Thank you. I emailed it to Becky and Jeff, and I think they should be able to make that available to you guys.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions at this point? If not, we'll come back to you from the commission standpoint, Elizabeth. I'm going to open it up for public comment. And it's specifically about land development code, folks. It can be anything land development code updated. It doesn't have to be what we talked about today. So if anybody has anything to say about land development code, please come up to the podium, and you have 3 minutes. Who would like to get us started? So please tell us your name, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Randy Swain. I'm an Albemarle resident, have been since 1976.
Do you want to explain why you're...
Yeah. So I'm just going to show a series of photos there, like 10 seconds piece. This is flooding on Inverness as a result of recent rain.
Sorry,
rain.
let me
That's
get
okay.
the,
This I'll
sharing.
talk while you do that. This is from July 1, and the Albemarle Neighborhood Association has concern that the Albemarle 9 golf course is part of a stream and ecosystem.
Sorry, Randy. Can you, thank you. Kurt, I can't find the Zoom to share the screen. I'm having trouble. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry, Randy.
Yes, how did you do that?
Good now? But where do I find the rest of them that doesn't look like it did before? Or do I close it and then?
Click on-
Okay. All right. We just lost it again.
I'll help you.
Yeah, why don't you just do it?
Kurt's got you.
Okay. All right, so this is flooding on the ninth hole of the Albemarle 9, so on the west side. This occurred after rain on July 1. We're going to go through several of these, all from the same rain. This is walking up the 8th hole. You can see all the erosion that's gone there because the owner quit watering the course about 1.5 years ago, and the grass has died on this particular place because of the sun on it, and so now there's significant erosion, and the water runs down here and runs into that flood area we just saw. The rest of the course looks like this for a different reason, because he's come in and cannibalized the zoysia sod to put on the other 18 holes that are still operating. We think this area needs to be protected as open space. We think building more houses in here and more concrete will be just contribute to the flooding. This is the pond on number 5 that was actually drained earlier this year, and we were concerned that if it were drained again, it would contribute to flooding. All the way to the other side of the property over by Hy-Vee on 23rd and Clinton Parkway. This is the Artera area, and you can see the flooding there. And now we're back at the flooding on the primary course, and this is on the first hole. Going back, I'm sorry, on the 9th hole, going back up the fairway, you can see the water's out of its banks. Now we're looking at, this is the, Doug Perico is a neighbor who has been sending me pictures. He lives on this hole. This is the, what was the first hole. And this is what his backyard has looked like for some time. The owner started construction here without a permit and was required to stop. And so this used to be a golf hole. And it's been, this is the current state, and it's been in this state for several months. We're doing, this is going to be our last one, I'm afraid, so. But I think y'all have the gist of it. This may be more of the same here. It's just continuing from the other one and shows more flooding. So I have somebody much more knowledgeable than me that's going to talk about the impact of the flooding. I just wanted to give you a sample of what it looked like. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, my name is Melinda Ball. The most important concern we have as a community is the protection of our environmentally sensitive areas and open green spaces. Plan 2040 reflects this. Many cities have environmental ordinances in place for well over a decade. Unfortunately, Lawrence has never had stream buffer and erosion control ordinances for protections outside the floodplain. As a video show, Albemarle area experiences substantial flooding caused by erosion from neglect. Flooding adds pressure downstream as those streams ultimately feed into the Wakarusa River and its riparian zone, including floodplain and wetlands. Water systems are connected, therefore the entirety of the system should share protections. Additionally, those protections must be enforced and not subverted in favor of the applicant. Carl Capps and Scott Robinson's recent meeting with the planning staff revealed that the Mid-American Regional Council guidelines for stormwater best management practices are the intended template. While these guidelines are currently being integrated into the proposed drafted code, we have nothing in place. The proposed guidelines remain subject to the interpretation, thus creating an uncertainty in what may result from the final draft. Additionally, the MARC 5600 will be revising guidelines in 2026. Under current code, there's a risk these essential water systems, including streams and associated habitat, could be destroyed. We strongly recommend that the Planning Commission and City not take any action that promotes development on existing open space that will threaten storm drainage, increase erosion, exacerbate environmentally sensitive conditions or concerns. Proposed development on sensitive lands must have public engagement, not fast-tracked with administrative approval. If Lawrence desires and values reputation as a green community, then it will do what is necessary to guarantee that the appropriate protections are taken now without further delay. This concern must be taken precedence as we are far behind the curve. There's too much at risk to let this proposed code be subject to one-year testing period, thereby threatening protections of environmentally sensitive areas. Designated open green spaces, including the Albemarle, should not, under any circumstance, be laboratories for developers to advance their profit goals with the support of their lawyers and engineers. Will you please commit to completing the City of Lawrence interpretation of the MARC guidelines no later than the implementation of the Land Development Code to prevent ponds from being filled, streams from being erased, and soils stripped by erosion and neglect, and habitats, very essential to navigating the future, being destroyed? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Please stay engaged.
I'm Dave Barnhill. I live on the 17th hole, and I could show you a lot of photographs and films. And Tommy had to pay a $400,000 fine over that. What more do you guys need to see, to realize that Lawrence stormwater rules are ridiculously out of date? They do not reflect modern thinking, and the developers are running roughshod over you. Wake up. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, sir.
Paul Meyer. I live on the lower side of Wimbledon Drive, the downhill side. I'm horrified by what I've heard already this evening. And my planned remarks were on the same theme. I have an early morning walk through the Albemarle neighborhood. And every year that I do that, I admire the planners of that neighborhood. Homes on the slopes and the higher reaches, and these thoughtfully planned valleys between that take care of that stormwater, at least until recent depredations to that environment. I'm struck on my early morning walks with the wildlife that I encounter there. Amazing birds, ponds, streams, springs. It's a wet area, but it's rich. Habitat must be preserved. It would be an ecological disaster if a proposed land use code fast-tracked developers to try the impossible task of coping with that stormwater. Concreting over the streams and the springs, destroying the wildlife. That must not happen. You don't want it to happen. And the neighbors of mine in Albemarle don't want it to happen. The Albemarle district, so carefully planned, must preserve the green space. We don't have a golf course now. That creates an even greater opportunity for us to designate it as a green space, an open space. I'd like you to seize that opportunity. This one-size-fits-all plan would be a potential disaster. So please, 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 zone Alvamar when you get the chance, when we come to that point. Zone it as a single-family R1. Finally, if part of the council's vision is to create some social engineering, some greater diversity under the misapprehension that it's a haven for rich white-only people, let me reassure you that on my early morning walks, I encounter all kinds of people, rich, poor, older, younger, young families, retired people. My neighbor is a Filipino. My neighbor across the street is a Hispanic. We have Muslims on our street. It's a very already rich, diverse neighborhood, partly due and in credit to the planners of that remarkable historic district we call Alvamar. So, I urge your thoughtful care in the days and weeks to come for the historic Alvamar district and its 1,100 residents. Someone said that was 40% of the...
So thank you for your comments, but you're at 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
That's where I plan to stop.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was lovely. I want to clumsily stumble through some numbers and ask you guys some questions.
Sure. What is your name? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Mandy Enfield, 1635 Mississippi Street.
Thank you.
And hopefully you guys can sort of follow me on this and put it on the back, like in the back of your minds to answer as you're working through this stuff.
Sure.
I'm University Place neighborhood, and I think you guys probably have heard me say already, we're 54% not owner occupied. 54% of our neighborhood is rentals, which is somewhat of a barrier for things if we're trying to do a vote. And then there's a lot of other pieces that go along with that. So with that in mind, I am trying to really understand how the density increase and the occupancy increase would impact our neighborhood, like actual numbers. So Jeff helped me understand how to calculate density the other day. And from that, I believe, well, I calculated not the 55%. 36% of our houses, so of the 242, 88 of those are eligible to add at least one more dwelling unit. So that's 36% of the houses by right can add an additional dwelling unit. If it's one, that's an additional 5 people per the code right now that would be put on a lot. Of those homes, 52% of those homes are not owner occupied. So 46 of those houses are not. So those are rentals. They're already investment properties who would have an incentive to add more students, more dwellings, or one more dwelling and more occupancy. But what I want to know from you guys, and put this in your head, 55% of the houses are 1.5 acres. Now, Jeff told me we don't round up. So if you do the density, that comes in at like 0.9. So does that make sense? You couldn't add one more unit because you can't round up. So it has to, like, you do the math for the density, and it has to be one or more to add a unit. So if it's 0.15 acres, it comes in at 0.9. And we just talked about the administrative procedure for residential neighborhoods. And it goes through the staff. There's a staff process. What I want to know is how is it going to work with variances? Like, would that be something where there's a variance because it's so close? You know, it's 0.9. It's the bulk of our neighborhood. 55% of our neighborhood is 0.15. So is there any risk that those houses, 134 homes in our neighborhood, could be eligible for an additional unit and 5 more people?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is Emil Tonkovich. I live on what used to be the 3rd fairway on the Alvamar 9 golf course. My home is a 2,000 square foot average home. I concur with what other people have said about the drainage and the destruction of wildlife that this new code will bring. But I want to talk about fairness. Fairness. My neighbors and I, through the years, have relied on written and verbal promises. Those promises have all been broken, and as a result, our property values have substantially depreciated in just the last 2 years alone. When I bought my home, as part of the purchase price was a membership to the Alvamar golf course. The developer promised that it would always be a golf course. When Mr. Fritzl bought the golf course, he too promised it would always be a golf course. And needless to say, like all buyers, I relied on the zoning codes at the time when I purchased my house. All of these promises have been broken, and our property values have depreciated substantially. I want to tell you about my neighbors. My next door neighbor is a retired secretary. She has lived in that home for many, many years. The 2 neighbors on my other side are young families. They purchased their homes 3 or 4 years ago when there was a golf course. I don't know the financial circumstances of my neighbors, but I can assure you that a retired secretary and young families, the bulk of their assets are in the equity in their homes. These broken promises so far have already substantially depreciated that equity in their homes. And if you adopt this new code to our neighborhood, it will devastate their equity. There is no doubt about it. And you have to ask yourself when you're deliberating, whose side are you going to be on? Are you going to be on the neighbors who have relied upon promise after promise after promise? Or are you going to be on the side of Mr. Fritzl, who will benefit from these code changes? And it will not only benefit to him financially, but it will be to the detriment of the entire free open space, the damage to water coming through there, the storm damages, not to mention the wildlife. It is unbelievable the destruction that will occur. You have to ask yourselves, are you going to be on the side of all of these people who have relied throughout these years,
Sir,
or on the side of Mr. Fritzl? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Michael Hallman. I'm speaking for Brook Creek Neighborhood, but these ideas also reflect some ideas from Lawrence Association of Neighborhoods. The new Land Development Code greatly expands administrative approvals and determinations while reducing the public's right to public hearings. There is an entire section of the code, 20-3502, devoted to describing that. Some cases relate to site constraints and design standards, while others have to do with uses of the land and uses of the code itself. While this relaxation of land use and procedures may gain us more mixed use and density, it unfortunately shrinks the ability of neighborhoods and property owners to protect their vested interests. Some think that this is a worthwhile trade-off, but it's hard to predict the results of this shift. As such, some feel that we'll just let the chips fall where they may. I'm not so fatalistic. If you feel that it's warranted to shift the balance between the property rights of developers and of neighborhoods, then I think you must at least strengthen the guardrails. The new code will open up many possibilities by adding by right duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes to residential zones, and adding administrative approval for certain design standards and variances. That's good. But we would be mistaken to conflate streamlining with fast tracking. That would be bad for due process. This is not a race. Right now, there are some 600 building lots waiting that have been recently annexed, waiting in the pipeline for platting, 600. And the so-called Panasonic panic has fizzled. The mixed-use density build-out can proceed with deliberation while also giving adequate time for citizens to be fully informed. At least the following two things must be assured. Administrative land use approvals must be accompanied by more robust public notice in advance that reaches more than just a radius of adjacent properties and that clearly spells out the appeal process. And the appeal deadlines must be extended. The new code proposes the same 9-day appeal time frame as the old code. Given the expanded impact of the new code, the appeal time should use the more common standard of 30 days. On a related matter, the neighborhood outreach meetings between the developer and the neighborhood must be required with no waiver possible from the planning director. And they must for items of rezonings, special use permits, major site plans, text amendments brought by a developer, preliminary plats, and preliminary development plans.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
For preliminary development plans as currently called for.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Marilyn Meyer. I've just got a little something from the heart, from my heart. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Just one thing. Please don't make these changes to a part of Lawrence that is beautiful, because once changed, can never come back to this community. Please know that your decision will affect this lovely town forever. It's a huge part of what Lawrence, Kansas is. And don't forget it, please.
Thank you.
My name is Shelley Barnhill, and I live on the Alvamar golf course. That's what I call it, I'm sorry, Jayhawk. In the 70s, I got to draw a whole bunch of golf courses in Austin, Texas. And so I really have grown up knowing the drainage, the wildlife, and the beauty. And one of the things that when I came to Lawrence and I began to see Alvamar as it was coming forth, it was a beautiful, beautiful subdivision. And you can see the beauty in the streets and in everything there. And all the cities I've been in had these kinds of subdivisions. Don't lose something that is so beautiful in its design. My father was a land planner for many years. 92 years old, he was still trying to plan land because he loved it so much. And the beauty of that land is just gorgeous. That subdivision, wow, it's still stellar. And I hope you keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Glenn Jewell. I first moved to Lawrence in the 60s. Now live in the Alvamar neighborhood. And one of the things that I noticed is that Lawrence has taken great pride in its green spaces. And one of the reasons I'm proud of Lawrence is because of its green spaces. And I believe that an area that's been enjoyed as green space for, in some cases, more than 30 years should be maintained as such and should not be subject to development. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Will, do we have anybody online that you can see?
It looks like Patrick Ross has his hand raised.
Let's give him a chance, then we'll come back to the room. Patrick, please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to address one specific aspect of the presentation. It was specifically referencing the BZA and their scope and review of administrative official error. And so I just wanted to ask the board, what can the public do when the BZA is circumnavigated by city planning, specifically in reference to John Passey's BZA appeal as it relates to the New Boston Crossing project, and how the city planning staff went beyond its authority to prevent his appeal from being heard? And with such large interest by the public, as you've heard tonight, in protecting open space and the environment, could there be some sort of entity in the land development code that gives the public a platform outside of these bureaucratic platforms, such as the BZA, the city commission meeting, yourselves, to be able to speak on environmentally sensitive issues? Because being involved with Save the Wakarusa River Valley Group, we have been able to offer evidence for projects such as the New Boston Crossing that they are illegal and that they were done incorrectly, and that the elements of the city that are designed to protect the public's interests are not being allowed to do so. And to speak to the individuals there in the room, unfortunately, concerns and arguments on floodplains and the destruction of the environment are being ignored by our city. And so I speak to everyone to say the only path forward is to do collective organizing within your communities and to educate everyone else who is unaware, because most of Lawrence is unaware of these issues, and to take an honest assessment of your city officials that are enacting these policies. This land development code is extremely important in that regard. The developers in Lawrence, their goal is to expand development into floodplain zones because Lawrence is surrounded by 3 different rivers. So building on floodplains is the only game left in town for them to be able to propose these large projects that aren't designed to solve this supposed issue of affordable housing in Lawrence, but only to ensure that they continue to get profit. And then you can look at every project out there, whether it's New Boston Crossing project or the project at the end of my street here in between Fall Creek, where the forest is going to be destroyed, and there are floodplain issues with that plan. So I impress upon the public more than anything to organize and to nominate officials that will actually represent the interests of Lawrence as it relates to environmental concerns. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else online? Else we'll...
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. Back to the room, if there's anybody in the room that would like to...
Can I use the rest of my 3 minutes? Serious.
Sure.
So, my wife didn't mention this, but almost every day we listen to the owls. We've got a family of owls in a set of trees. We've got a family of hawks over just very close.
Eagles.
And eagles. We've got we listened to the coyotes last night that live in the little copse that's down on that fairway. And I mean, it really is an ecological gem. You've got all the way up to Dad Perry, down through the Girl Scout cabins and all that, and down through the golf course. You can't replicate that again. Whoever said that is absolutely right. The minute you build on that land, and Tommy's already taken out all the retaining.
So I'll give you another 10 seconds, sir.
Frogs lived.
Thank you.
I got it in there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I didn't call him a 4-time felon or anything.
Thank you. All right. This is the last chance for public comment. If there's nobody in the room or online, I'm going to close public comment. So this is your last chance. I'm going to bring it back to the commission. If the commission has any questions of people that have asked questions, we can entertain it if there's a consensus from the commission. Otherwise, we're just going to have discussion amongst ourselves. So I'll open it up for discussion. Who would like to start?
I'm actually going to run to the restroom. Just real.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Let's take a break. Let's take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Take a 5-minute break. Sorry, 5-minute break. Well, I think we're gonna. I don't know that we ever stopped the recording, but yeah. Well, let's continue. So we're gonna start the discussion, and I think you were gonna say something, Chair. Commissioner. Go ahead. Sorry.
Little brain freeze.
Brain freeze. Yeah, big time.
So, several comments, but just one to start out with. So the 9 days on the appeal, I am the one of the election judges out in Marion Township. Went to a meeting yesterday with Jamie Shue, and he said it takes about 8 or 9 days now for the mail to get from in town back to their office. I have no reason to doubt that that's true, and I would think that is an argument not to keep the 9-day administrative appeal, not to keep it at 9 days. It has to be expanded. So the letter goes out one day. If it takes 9 days, by the time it gets out to the people that are in the area or to the neighborhood association, there is no time for that neighborhood to discuss what's going on. So I would certainly be in favor, excuse me, of expanding this to 30 days. Now, if everything can be done early in the process rather than at the end as they go along, I think that is a better procedure, but 9 days is far too short. I think we are, it is a disservice when we don't have control over the mail.
I was going to ask Elizabeth, are you still there?
Yes, now I'm here.
You had said something that this came up in the neighborhood meetings, and you had mentioned that your proposal was that when the application was filed, a notification would go out. Was that what you said?
That's correct.
Okay.
I'm coming back to the slide. So on the thing that is happening now, and it will be carried forward under the code, is when someone does a single family development or a duplex development, they don't have to do notice to the neighbors or the neighborhood. So there's no change to that. So in just thinking about these issues together, and I have to confess I didn't think about the mail, because our mail person comes about, like, I don't know, once every 3 days, it seems like anymore. Yeah. That it would be better all the way around if notice were provided by the applicant up front, so those conversations could take place long before someone gets to appeal.
Right, and if that was the case, then we're talking way more than 9 days, right? I mean, potentially weeks.
30 days.
Well, they would need to provide. So when the applicant submits their application, so I'm submitting my application for building permit and for my house zoning review. At that point in time, I would provide notice to whatever amount of space the Planning Commission recommends, so that as my application goes through the process, the neighbors know there's something going on, so it's not a surprise to them when the administrative determination is made.
Yeah.
So at that point, 9 days may or may not be the right number, but the hope is that they aren't scrambling at that point, because they've been following the application. So they know when the decision was made and what the decision was, and 6 days after the fact, they're not finding out something got approved and they wanted to appeal it.
Sure. So could they appeal it right from the very beginning? I mean, like, application goes in, they don't like it. Is that I don't know, statutory?
Yeah, no, they can't do that. They have to wait for the approval.
Gotcha.
Because changes could be made to the application that address the thing that they wanted to see addressed. So they would have no reason to appeal that.
I see.
A quick comment, if I can. We discussed this in the steering committee team as well, and versions of a couple different things. One issue with 30 days is that means that every single application, whether there was a cause to appeal or not, there's going to be an additional month added to the timeline, which is it's cost and time. Because if that rule says that they have a 30-day window, everything's just going to freeze. So the discussion was, well, how can we get to both some fairness for those who might have a concern without putting a burden on every single thing that would come through? And there was some discussion about extending the time, not the third, well, there was some discussion about 30 days, but because of that issue, we generally moved away from that. And that idea of giving notification up front so that people were ready, so that people, if there was some concern, seemed to be a pretty good solution. It still puts a burden on the developer. It also develops a practice or continues and expands a practice of creating communication in between developers and neighbors around a project. So I do share the desire to have a fair opportunity for neighbors to participate and to express any concerns or deliver new information that might be not be present at the time of an administrative approval. But I would caution us to think about the impact of what a 30-day by default would mean to the overall process.
Yeah, I have to say, I like the idea of the notice up front. That seems to be a little more efficient. Getting people in the process earlier, I think, is always better, so they know what's going on. Concerns can be addressed. So possibly the appeals, actually, it doesn't take, there won't be as many appeals because those issues can be addressed up front.
Right.
I don't know about the time once there is an appeal in terms of Commissioner Thomas's concern. I mean, maybe not 30 days, but if there is a concern with an appeal, maybe there's another number, except for, I mean, 30 days does seem excessive.
Mm-hmm. It sounded like she said most neighborhoods wanted 14, Elizabeth said.
How many appeals are being made now? Is that something that happens routinely?
No, not routinely. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. We maybe have 4 to 5 a year, and we maybe do 200, 300 site plans. So there's not a lot, I would say, at this point in time. I don't have any numbers. I'm just working off of memory here for the most part, but it's not a routine situation.
So is there any reason to believe that somehow we suddenly have more appeals than we ever had before?
I don't know the answer to that one either there. The thing is, what we do is when an application is complete with a site plan, it just basically gets parked for the duration of the appeal window. So if it's 9 days or 30 days, that application can't move to building permits or any other action for the length of the appeal window. So that's the only thing that would be for the commission's knowledge on that one. So if it's a 9-day, it sits for 9 days, and then we would continue on. Otherwise, it will sit for 30 days. That does have a burden potentially for the applicants on that one, but for staff, just so you know, it's not really a processing burden. We would just complete it and just have it idling.
And currently, do the appeals go to the BZA or do they go to the City Commission?
Depending on the appeal that it is, site plan appeals go to City Commission. Other appeals, as they're dictated in Land Development Code, would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
So does this new code change any of the standards for the Board of Zoning Appeals for those kinds of appeals?
Elizabeth might correct me if I step astray here, but those are typically outlined under state statute, so it's not something that can be changed. We'd have to follow that, but you can always add to it. I don't think you can go lesser than what is required under state statute.
Because I thought Elizabeth said that the standard was, did the administrator err? And I don't think that's the current state standard for what you look at.
There is a differential between when you have an administrative determination or administrative decision that you're looking at versus if you're asking for a setback variance or something of that sort. And then just so the board is aware, and anybody that's watching is aware, is Board of Zoning Appeals cannot grant use variances in Kansas. So if a use is not permitted in a zoning district, it can't give you a use that is not there. So height, parking, setbacks, those are the ones you typically would see going to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
So we're not changing any of that with the new land development code?
For the
for the standards for the Board of Zoning Appeals, what they're going to do, it'll still be the same that they've always done because it's a matter of state statute.
Yeah, that's my expectation of that, and haven't read all the way through the adopted draft to confirm that bit with what we've seen tonight. But yes, that is the expectations, we'd hold that code.
But which appeals have been going to the City Commission that now will go to the Board of Zoning Appeals?
I'm sorry, Commissioner Eldridge, we didn't change anything about what gets appealed where, and I could be the cause of this confusion. Site plans will still go to City Commission. Other things will still go to the BZA. So the standards for review haven't changed. Really nothing about the existing process has changed. We've carried that forward. So the request is, neighborhoods still want to know more about what's going on. It comes to us in context of changes to the code where now a duplex could go in next door. It actually could go in next door under the current regs in a lot of places, but I think some of this is anticipatory of changes that are allowed in the new code. So even if the new code says something, something could happen that couldn't happen before, the review and appeal process is exactly the same as it was before.
Okay.
And Jeff, thank you. Do you have another thing you were going to say? I'm sorry. Commissioner Eldridge, are you done with that? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. Jeff, did you say that per year it's roughly 300 applications and like 4 or 5 get appealed? Is that what you said? Something like that?
That's my guess.
Okay.
Typically, depending upon the year, you might see anywhere between 200 and 300 site plans typically. And with some recent changes, you'll probably see less of those because there are some, as Elizabeth noted, we had a 3-step or a 3-level site planning process. We've gone to a 2-level site planning process just with a recent amendment. So there's probably a bit of a,
sure,
given that number, but that's my estimate at the moment.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead, Sharon.
No, I'm taking a tangent from this, so go ahead if you're on this one.
Am I correct in thinking that under the new code, there are more administrative appeals under the new code than the old one?
Do you mean approvals?
Approvals. Yes, administratively, under the new code, more things can be approved administratively. And that's really not so much the BZA or appealing to the city council, but administrative decisions that are made. That's the 9-day period that is current. Mail the letter out to the right distance, maybe mail it to the head of the neighborhood association. And someone can answer, am I correct in saying under the new code, there are more administrative decisions that can be made?
That was my question as well.
Jeff, do you want me to take that to start with?
Sure.
So the answer is yes. It just primarily in terms of uses. One of the bigger changes in the code was to move more uses away from the special use permit process and into administrative approval with standards. So that would be probably the bigger change we'd see. In terms of structures themselves, I think the code doesn't really expand what's going through administrative approval, but it clarifies the whole list of things that would have been going through administrative approval currently. So the answer is yes. There will be more things, but it will be primarily uses that otherwise would have been approved in a more public setting.
Can you give an example?
I cannot off the top of my head remember a use that used to be special use permit and that is now administrative review. But it would have been uses that in discussion between the consultant and staff and potentially steering committee were uses that could be regulated by a set of set standards. So the big things that still have community-wide impact that would be of the greatest concern to the neighbors, that is still going to go through a full city process. I can flip the code and give you some examples at our next meeting, but off the top of my head, I can't remember, and I'm sorry about that.
I think what Elizabeth said, that some of the administrative decisions that will be made now would have had more public view under the old code. And so what I hear is that people are saying these administrative decisions may be perfectly all right. They may be a great thing to have happen, but they're not public. They are not out for the public to see and to, I think transparency is something we've talked about for a long time. Having things out early, having the developer meet more often with the people in the area where it's involved is something I think we have all asked about and hoped for, and certainly the people that are affected have wanted that. Any of the decisions, though, 9 days is not, in my opinion, and just based upon what Jamie Shue said yesterday, we can run into some real problems where there is no time to appeal. There is no time for neighborhood associations to meet and see what they think about it. And in this process, more than any other I've seen, the land development has gone to every neighborhood association and said, we want you to be involved. We want you to be more involved. We're coming to meet with you. And now it seems like we're saying, but not on these administrative decisions. We want to keep it shorter. It needs to be expanded. Is 30 days a magic number? No. Was 9 days a magic number? No. But something greater than 9 days that gives the people a chance to look at what's going on, have a chance to state what they would like.
Is there even a, sorry, I just want one clarifying question. Is there even a requirement, if it's administrative approval, is there a requirement for public outreach? Well, I mean, is there even a requirement for that?
That's one of the conversations we're hoping to have with you all as part of this.
I see.
And I just want to, I think we're blending two things here in the conversation, and I want to highlight it. There is a difference between the 9-day appeal of a site plan and the 30-day appeal of an administrative determination in the code.
Right.
So in the draft of the code, the site plans have a different appeal window time than an appeal of an administrative determination. So I just want to clarify is that there's different times depending upon what application is in process for the appeal windows.
Got it. So the site plan is 9 days. What's the other one that's 30 days?
An administrative...
administrative approval? Or?
Yeah, I'm going to get my ones here right. An appeal of an administrative determination
30 days.
is 30 days in the code as it's currently drafted. So there are different windows depending upon the different applications in play.
And that's what we have on the books. That's what is it? That's in the code, or it's on the books today?
That's in the current draft. In the current code today, it would be 9 days for a site plan, and I believe 30 days for an administrative appeal.
So it's not changing. In the new code, it's going to stay the same.
I'll double check that, but I believe that's the case.
Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So since we were talking about one compromise for this is to do more notice up front. I'm curious about some details on that. What decisions are we talking about that would have greater notice up front, and what would that notice entail?
So one of the things that is, let me answer the question specifically. We look to you guys to give us some guidance about what we think would be good in terms of notice. We recommend a fairly limited notice, and we do that because the nature of an administrative determination is that if the applicant comes through and they comply with the requirements of the Land Development Code, staff will approve that application. So someone can come in and they can be in compliance and they'll get approved. We've now told the neighbors that they can comment on the application. They may be commenting about aspects of the application that aren't subject to change because that application will be approved according to the code. So this is a place where many communities find they want to provide the notice, and they do provide the notice. Lawrence moving to notice on administrative approvals is in line with changes that are going on in lots of communities. The trick is to figure out how we want to let everybody know that you can comment, but showing up and commenting that you don't like the traffic is not necessarily going to result in a different decision on the application. Maybe I went into too much detail. I'm saying sometimes we can have really missed expectations when we're in that administrative approval realm. And so we want to be clear what we're letting the applicants know. You can know what's going on. You can comment on what's going on. And this applicant, their standard was comply with the code. So that's the place where we're dealing right now.
Yeah. So just to add to that, this is just within the city of Lawrence. This isn't county.
That's correct.
We don't have any complexities with rural mail or anything. It's all right here. And it's also another way to word what I think, and correct me if I get this wrong, is what you just said was these are things that are typically by right.
Yes.
So it's not a special thing. It's not a special use. It's by right. And if you comply with the code, up until this discussion, we haven't had any requirement. If someone wants to paint their house, well, it's probably too light of an example. Whatever the thing was they might be doing to their property through a building permit process or through a site plan, if it's code compliant, they just automatically roll through this.
Yeah.
But because, because the land development code offers some different things that they might be able to do by right, there's an understandable concern by neighbors to say, hey, if I'm just 3 doors down, they're going to convert to a duplex that is now by right that never was before. I want to know about that. The question, though, becomes, sure, you can know about it, and you can even be told that you have an opportunity to appeal. But it could be somewhat disingenuous to let someone believe that just because they have the opportunity to appeal, that means that they can, that their desire would supersede what statute requires of us if someone's compliant with the code. So that finding that right connection with that appeal process and making sure that it is fair to both the applicant and to the neighbor is, I think, what we're trying to get at. And that's why I believe that notification up front makes the most sense. I'm less concerned about the mail issue. I'm not saying that I ignore it completely, but this is only inside the city limits of Lawrence, and there's lots of ways to get that information to City Hall if somebody wants to. Anyway, just wanted to throw that additional color on it.
Does the land development code that we're looking at now have a list of all of the uses that would be of right, number one? And number two, does it list all the factors that are considered? And number three, can any of those be varied with administrative adjustments?
The land development code has a use table in it, and that tells you the process you go through to get your use approved.
Can you give
I can pull it up. Give me 1 second here. Okay. That might make it easier.
And in reading through the code, Commissioner Eldridge, I did find that it was sort of mind-numbing as to the factors involved in what qualifies as an administrative decision, at least in my mind.
Mind-numbing? No. Sorry. Okay, hang on. I'm almost there. I think mind-numbing is probably one of the nicer things the zoning code has been called. All right, let me share screen again with everyone. Okay, so here we go. All right, I can make this a little bit bigger.
What is the code section that you're pulling up there?
I'm in Article 8. You can see this on the top right. Article 8, Section 20-803, permitted use table.
And this contains all the permitted uses, whether they're by right or...
Yeah, that's correct. So if you look at the top of the table in the blue line, it tells you P is a permitted use, S is a special use, and if it's blank, the use is not permitted. And they're allocated across the different zoning districts. To go to your question, if it's a P, it's permitted, and that's a by right. So there's no additional approval on that. Then if there are special use specific standards, if you look down the far right column where you see the cross references to other sections. So if you want to do a daycare center, which is a special use in most districts, you also have regulations in section 20-805A that you have to comply with. If we go to 20-805A, so then we have here, if you're doing a daycare center, you have to maintain a wall or a fence that's at least 4 feet in height, and you require special use approval in residential or mixed and commercial zoning districts unless you're accessory to a school, religious assembly, or permitted as a community facility. So that's how you figure out what uses are that you can do and what the extra rules are.
And can any of those regulations be waived with an administrative adjustment?
So an administrative adjustment is applicable only to measurable standards. So let's go back to, okay, so the daycare center has to maintain a wall or a fence that's at least 4 feet in height. So you could probably do an administrative adjustment on fence height. Hold on, I have to do math on my phone here. I can't do it in my head. So let's say you had a 4-foot fence and you could do a 20% adjustment to that. Whoops. So you could bring your fence down to 3.2 feet. So the administrative adjustment is set as a maximum percentage of change to a measurable standard. So it's intended to only accomplish very small changes. It's definitely not intended to allow an applicant to come in and wipe out a requirement.
Mm-hmm. So Elizabeth, a follow-up question on that point, because there's I think a good question posed by a member of the public this evening. Would that adjustment be available with respect to density standards, given that those are numerical in nature as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I appreciate that came up this evening. I made a note to say to add to the draft, and this can come from Planning Commission recommendation or Steering Committee recommendation, that it does say in the adoption draft that you have to round down. Just like the member of the public was saying, we can add language in there that says you have to round down, it cannot be adjusted or varied. So we can take that out of the realm of things that can be changed.
Right.
Speaking of the 20% you mentioned, I did see a table in here that had, here it is, table 2016-7, administrative adjustments.
Yep.
So it's table 2016-7 with all the administrative adjustments and what is allowed. So, and most of these are 20% here. So I'm wondering where that came from, since it seems they're all 20%.
Correct.
For all these adjustments. So how did you come to that figure? And the reason I'm asking, because I was looking through these and I saw accessory building height. So allowable adjustment is 20%. So if you were building a 30-foot high building, you could adjust that to be 36 feet height. And that seems kind of significant in a tight residential area to me. So I'm just curious about that, where that 20% came from.
Hang on one second. I'm about to pull that table up that you were referencing so everyone can take a look at it. So while I'm getting there, the 20% is a standard that we use based on experience with doing codes like this for communities across the country. tend to start at 15 or 20%. We go back and we talk to clients and ask how they used that administrative adjustment process. We find that the 20% number is typically just kind of the right range. That's the Goldilocks number for where everyone is comfortable that staff is making reasonable changes. Anything above that, most communities want to see you come in because you're making such significant change to the code that they want to know what you're up to. So you would need to go through a variance process. Some communities do a middle level adjustment process, but that, gets kind of squishy. So we tend to say you can do 20% with staff, and everything above that, you're going to need to come in for variance on. So it's an adjustable number if Planning Commission sees fit, but that's the number that we typically start with based on experience. And I'm sorry, I tried to jump to that place in my document and I just lost the entire document. So it'll hopefully reappear. We'll see.
As a follow-up on that point, potentially for Commissioner Rexroad, did the 20% number, was that discussed in the steering committee, and pros, cons? Was that a point of discussion or debate at all?
I honestly don't have a specific recollection of that inside the steering committee, Steve. Sorry.
Oh, appreciate it.
Jeff, on the 20% variance, do you see it like people coming in and requesting that, knowing that that's their threshold and sort of trying to slip in under the radar with, 39.89 inches instead of for the given number at beginning? Does that my question make sense? Like, are people intentionally taking advantage of that 20%?
We don't have anything like that now, so I don't have any background to it.
We don't?
No. Okay. So the code currently has, I can't remember, this is the problem. I'm getting the new code and the old code blended together, so I may get this a little wrong here. The current code has the ability of the planning director or staff to do something kind of an equivalent of an administrative waiver, and there's almost no guardrails around it. So we don't use it because we have no leeway of knowing what's too much or what's too little. We kind of just, it's there, if there's, a great example was we had a piece of sidewalk that couldn't be built because it was over a gas meter. And so that let's not do that because we don't want to cover the gas meter in concrete. That's kind of a good example. Or something very similar to that, but there's not a lot of wiggle in the current code, so we don't have any of those guardrails or any of that kind of process that you're seeing in today's code. Gotcha. Most of what would happen is if you started to kind of get into some of these deviations is that it go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, because that's the only avenue that has the ability to grant those deviations away from it. And since we don't really have a lot of footing there, there's a lot of cases that go to BZA that do very small things, a foot here or a foot there or something like that. So that is
the intention of this is to create some flexibility so that it doesn't have to go to BZA each time for these minor variances or these minor shifts in the plan, like, a 5-foot difference or a 6-foot difference of something, as long as it meets the requirements of the base code within that 20% variant or that adjustment period or area, it can be approved without having to go through the old rigmarole.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Can I pose an example? I mean, in terms of along just those very lines. So let's say somebody is building the accessory building height, and there's an administrative adjustment to go from 30 to 36 feet. The neighbor who has been notified could then appeal that.
Correct.
Under this draft.
Right. That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yes.
But maybe, depending on how far that notice goes, somebody 4 or 5 houses down might not know. And the question, would that be necessary anyway? But just for my purposes of my example, the neighbor would know that and have a chance to appeal.
Yes. That's my understanding of the code as it's laid out.
Yeah. Appeal
BZA.
And the test would be if there's a hardship, regular BZA factors?
Well,
So this would be an appeal? So that would be error.
Error.
And so the administrator wouldn't have made an error if it's within 20%.
Yeah, the error effectively is if I can't do math and I get the number wrong, that's a different thing than if I, get the math right. That would be the error potentially, I think, in your scenario, if I'm following it correctly.
Okay, I see. So the 20% allows that building height to be up to 36 feet by an adjustment.
By right. Mhm.
And there would be, there could be an appeal, but just because there's an appeal, it doesn't mean that changes, obviously, because it's not in error.
Correct.
If it was
So a couple
37
things
feet.
on that. Let's look at what's up on the screen, because there are some limitations.
Okay.
The review criteria are whether or not the thing that is being requested to be adjusted is permitted in the district, right? So it has to be legal. Whether it allows development that's consistent with the zoning district. Maybe, that would be the first place where we really have to think twice about, do we allow a 36-foot tall accessory structure? Whether the impact of the adjustment is internal to the subject property and will not impede the normal and orderly development or improvement of adjacent properties. The D is kind of the one that may, be the one that would keep someone from just saying, I need, an extra 20% on my accessory structure. Whether the adjustment is required to compensate for an unusual site condition, correct a minor inadvertent failure to comply with an LDC standard, which nobody does on purpose, but does happen in real life, or to protect a previously undiscovered sensitive resource or natural feature. So taken all together, the goal isn't to say you get 20% because you want it, but you can get the 20% adjustment when the circumstances warrant that taking place. In all cases, the director, be that Jeff or whoever sits in that chair, can say no. They can say no, it needs to go to variance. You're going to have too much of an impact on your neighbor. This isn't something we're going to allow.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
What was that site? I just saw the C, but I didn't.
Hang on a second, Commissioner Eldridge. I cut off the section numbers when I was trying to change the document.
Just review and decision making.
I think it's 20-1605.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, 2016-05, so B, as in boy.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Unless, it's sort of related to this, but not so much down in the weeds. I was trying to get back to the larger table. Since we've been talking about notice, we've had some discussion about having possibly greater notice up front. That relates to the table 20-16-3. Summary table of review procedures. I mean, one of the things that might be helpful to add to that table would be what is the notification requirement like that. Then we'd have all of it in one place. But I know that there was discussion in the steering committee about a neighborhood meeting, a public outreach meeting. And right now, that is only required for a preliminary development plan. And I know that's a big point of discussion that we should probably have at the Planning Commission level about do we like what we see in this table about neighborhood meetings and when that is required.
Yeah, Elizabeth, can you clarify that? Because I know that in the steering committee you guys talked about that. Is your discussion reflected in here? Sorry.
So we have not made changes to this version. It still says only the neighborhood hearing for, I believe, was that preliminary plat for a PUD?
Preliminary
PDP.
Development Plan.
yeah.
Preliminary development plan. Yeah, so that's first step of a PD. The steering committee did not instruct us to add that as a requirement. We did talk, though, in steering committee about the challenges of requiring an applicant to do a neighborhood meeting and not having anybody show up for it, which is kind of a reality that we've heard working on the project in Lawrence. So in terms of making that change, we had suggested saying that the developer or the applicant will offer a neighborhood meeting. We'll formally offer a neighborhood meeting to the neighborhood association, which the difference is right now, kind of the applicant sets up the meeting and says, we're having it here at this time, at this day. And if nobody shows up, great. If somebody shows up, great. So we thought we would back that up and say, you'll offer a meeting. You have to get, confirmation from the neighborhood association, whether or not they do or don't want to have it. If they don't want to have it, you're off the hook. If they want to have a meeting, then you're going to schedule a meeting and let everybody know about it. So we kind of added a step in there just in terms of processing conceptually. If you want to give us guidance that you would like to see more neighborhood meetings, as soon as my screen comes back up, we will go to that page.
Well, when you, so what you're talking about, well, let me just clarify real quick. When you're talking about offering a meeting, are you talking about still, would that check mark still be only in the preliminary development plan box, or would that be for other?
We would change the check mark. It would go into all of the boxes where it needed to be offered. It's just that, and I'm sorry that I made that sound like they were related. It's just that it would provide an applicant with a little more, confidence that people were going to show up for the meeting, that the neighborhood wanted it, and that people would show up for it. So you can change the check boxes. Planning Commission can recommend changes to those boxes, which I'm trying to get up right now, and then we can clean up the process to say, if the neighborhood doesn't want it, you don't have to have it. Does that make sense?
This is Gary. I just want to add, so a little puzzled by this. As we left the Steerco, I thought that we had a pretty clear set of definitions around this. There were a couple things. One is the requirement wasn't to have a meeting. It was to offer and make available a meeting, because if we write it in code, you have to have a meeting and someone doesn't want to meet, well, that's a problem. So the offer is there, but the intention is that we do that. Two, that this offer comes post-application, and that it is on for all items that require a public process. So anything that will
I
come
got that wrong. I apologize. Thank you for clarifying.
That's, yeah. Anything that'll come through a public process. So we've got those things in place, and Steerco anyway felt pretty good about that being a way to assure that public was involved on a broader set of things. Post-application is really, really important, because pre-application, which some of the language had been there before, people just, the project isn't defined enough that the meeting would be meaningful in any way. So those were the things that the conclusions we came to.
Thank you. My sincere apologies. So we'll note that in steering committee changes. Whoops.
Thank you. So that means an offer of a meeting would be required for each of these boxes then?
Everything above the gray, everything that says city commission or BZA decision.
Okay.
So most of what we're seeing on the screen here.
Post-application, yes.
Yep.
Okay.
And is that language in this draft, Elizabeth, or are you going to add that?
No, I have to add it. I'm sorry, I missed that one.
So the requirement for...
The committee also made a small change to add residential parking back in, and that's where my brain was. So I lost track of this one, but I will add it to the list of changes that will be made.
We can talk about the residential. We're not going to do parking today, though. At least I don't think.
I thought we'd bring that up later for fun.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for something like the text amendment, sometimes there's either, it's hard sometimes to define a neighborhood, or there's many neighborhoods involved in a text amendment. So I'm a little unclear how that would work. For an offer, who would be offered the meeting?
Yeah, so we have added a definition of neighborhood.
Okay.
Hold on, let me get us there. Which could be subject of fun discussion also. So, whoops. Something's going swirly here. So we tried to add a definition of neighborhood without using the city's neighborhood map, although it would be easier to do that. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost that definition somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to stop and figure out where the definition went. But we added a definition of neighborhood to get to that point. So talk to me a little bit about how text amendments work in Lawrence. Is it normally one applicant asking for it, or is that more led by staff?
I mean, generally, it's either led by staff or at the request of the Planning Commission or the City Commission. So it's you do get citizen-initiated text amendments, and they do go through the process, but they go to City Commission to see if they want staff to initiate that one. But most of the text amendments have typically come from staff or from one of the governing bodies or the Planning Commission.
So I suppose that's something we would want to clean up in the what if category, but it doesn't, in Lawrence, like most places, it's typically not the what happens in real life category. So we can provide some guidance in the revised draft about if an individual wants to lead a text amendment, who they need to provide notice to, which would be a pretty big lift, I think.
That's what concerned me, is that the text amendment box having a required of a neighborhood meeting would be hard to define. And essentially what it is a public hearing, which is what is already required for a text amendment.
Yeah. Most of the amendments, I can't think of an amendment that was geographically specific, because they typically occur in a code that is applied citywide. So it would be, we've always used Planning Commission or the initiation of the text amendment as a way to kind of get that out there to have that discussion, because we don't sometimes, in best intentions, you might not know who all is interested in it until it hits that meeting, because you can't really have a public meeting that's citywide. It's other than,
right.
So it's kind of a difficult one on that list, yeah.
Should we exempt text amendments from the neighborhood meeting requirement? That would seem to be the most efficient thing to do and the most realistic thing to do.
Yeah. Well, except sometimes you have neighborhood planning documents that are part of the comprehensive plan, and there are text amendments that apply just to the Southern Development Plan or just to one of those plans.
We process as comprehensive plan amendments and not text amendments. So they would be processed in a different amending process as part of that. So when those go through, we do tend to send a wide notice and have those meetings as part of the comprehensive planning process, but that would be separate of a text amendment.
Okay.
So I'm just going to take a temperature check. It's 8:30. Does anybody have any major subjects that we haven't covered that you guys would like to discuss, or do we want to continue along this path that we're on? Is there anything that we haven't covered that we want to hit?
I have
you have more notes? Okay.
More notes.
I do want to come back to what you started with, Commissioner Thomas, the notification period, and see if there's some kind of consensus. If we're comfortable with what we have currently, or if we want to change that. So I have that noted. We'll come back to that. But go ahead.
Oh, just, I don't know if we want more discussion on that table and the notice, because my other big question was I wanted some explanation around floodplain.
Please
permitting.
go ahead.
So in terms of the floodplain permits, by state statute, there is a floodplain administrator, and that person is designated as the director of planning in this case, correct?
Yeah, if I remember the state statute correctly, yes, and then or designee or some language to that effect.
Mm-hmm. So can you, can you explain why it is that is an administrative decision, the floodplain permits? Is it because of the limited nature of development in floodplain, or can you explain why that is?
I can't. I don't know how the language of the state statute is, because we get model language from that statute, and I've not seen that model language in quite a while, so I don't know why that is calibrated at that level.
Is it required to be an administrative?
I don't know the answer to that either. I'm not exactly sure on that front.
Would that be a question for one of the city attorneys in terms of figuring out why that is set like that?
It's probably a question for planning staff. We can take a look and see what it is, because it's, we've talked to the state and federal agencies on that one, and I don't know if that is model language, if that is a state preference language. I don't know the details on that, but we can take a look and find out.
Yeah, that would be interesting to me, is why that's an administrative decision. Now, I haven't been through in gory detail for some of this floodplain development language. I know that what is allowed to be built in a floodplain currently is limited, so I'd be curious to know if maybe there are some development proposals that might require a little bit more than an administrative review, and then some that are obviously smaller decisions, dimensions, things like that. If an agricultural building is allowed to be built in a floodplain and somebody's just going to tweak the height or whatever, I get that that's an administrative decision. But I'm curious as to at what level of development can be allowed to be an administrative decision.
We will have to take
So
a
that
look
would
and
be-
have conversations
yeah,
to
okay.
find out.
Thank you.
Did the steering committee resolve the issue of the R1 zoning district? Is it going to also have multiple units in it, or is it going to remain single-family?
Steering committee did not make any changes to the definition of any of the zoning categories.
So we have one zoning district that's single-family and 7 that are multifamily?
Correct.
The single family is allowed in multiple districts. So the
That is
goal is,
true.
it doesn't get rid of the option to do single family development. It just adds an option to do other types of development.
But as a matter of right, not as a rezoning as that would have to be for the R1. Can you explain to me why that is, why all the zoning districts are not being treated the same way?
I can, and I will. I will ask, though, we have set up an entire evening for the residential discussion and notified people that it would be taking place on that evening. So I don't know if Planning Commission wants to dive into this tonight or wait until the point in time when the public's around for that conversation.
Well, I don't mind waiting.
I would prefer to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I just wanted to be sure we talked about it.
Yep, I think that's scheduled for 2 meetings from now.
Okay.
Let's see. Notes.
I'll ask a question while you're looking. So, Elizabeth, so my neighbor is going to build an ADU, and it's by right. And I want to, I don't like the design, or I don't like something. Is that, first of all, as the person building the ADU, since I have the right, do I have to get a site plan for that? Can I just go ahead and do it? Or do I have to go to the city and get an approval for me to build an ADU if I have the right to do it?
So I'm not sure if an ADU triggers a site plan. If you were to build an entire house, you're going to trigger a site plan. Jeff, what's the answer, or Becky, the answer to that one?
So we don't site plan detached dwellings or duplexes or ADUs in the city of Lawrence. So it would just go directly to building permits if it's allowed in the district and the drawing meets that. And as part of the building permit process, we have what's called a Chapter 20 review. And at that point, that's when a planner would look through the building permit and go, it's meeting the setbacks, the heights, the development code regulations, and then that would get approved under the building permit process.
So if I just started building and my neighbors noticed I was doing this, would they complain to you and say, hey, this person didn't talk to the city, they're just doing their thing? Or
we do get those from time to time where somebody does it. They're called work without a permit, and we will go and check on such things like that. But if you do have a building permit, then we would just simply say, your neighbor has this building permit. Here's what they've been approved to do. But when you're doing that, you typically have a lot of inspectors that are coming by to check not just the rough ends, the electrical, but also finishes and things like that. So there's a lot of inspections when you have a building permit along the way.
Got it.
But yeah, so detached dwellings, duplexes, and an ADU would just be a direct building permit.
Building permit. Go ahead.
I did find out if anybody has anything to jump in. I want to take us to the final development plan, applicability and consistency. I don't know, on the agenda, the version that was in the agenda packet, I'm looking at page 348 and 349, still under administration and procedures. Basically, what this is talking about is when the final development plan includes any major change from the approved preliminary development plan, the applicant must submit the preliminary development plan for rehearing and reconsideration through the original review process. And it goes on to list what a major change is. And so that all looks good, but what I'm wondering about is what if the major change is that the final development plan does not meet the proposed mixed-use goals that might have been proposed in the preliminary development plan. I don't know if this is possible, but a preliminary development plan was presented, approved. There's a major change in the fact that, let's say, well, they're no longer going to have retail on the ground floor. It's no longer going to be the mixed-use type of development that was proposed and that the city wants as a goal, because they're going to take some critical pieces of that mixed use out. They're going to take some critical residential piece. They're going to take some critical retail piece. So I'm wondering if that can also qualify as a major change. And I'm basing this on experience with some development projects that did not quite live up to their promises in the final development plan.
I'm looking at the major change list. So, hang on, let me share this with everybody. Oops, that's not the right one. Okay. So if the final development plan includes any major changes from the approved preliminary development plan, we're in section 2016-04. And so a major change is one that increases the proposed gross residential density or intensity by more than 5%, involves a reduction in the area set aside for common open space or other open spaces, increases by more than 10% the total floor area proposed for non-residential uses, increases the total ground area covered by buildings, changes to a residential use or building type, increases the height of buildings by more than 5 feet, or changes to a residential building type or a non-residential structure by more than 10% in size. So in the mixed-use example that you gave us, I suppose there's a workaround here by saying, A, if they took out the commercial part of the mixed use and they're changing it to residential, they're likely going to hit A.
Okay.
But we could add clarity to this and say, changes to a mixed use development that reduce the amount of either the residential or the non-residential by more than 10%. That would trigger a restart on the project. Usually if that's the case, if they can't do it, it's probably the market isn't going to support it anyhow, so they may want to rethink what they're up to.
It may be covered in here. It just wasn't obvious to me, and it's just a concern of mine, just because this has happened in the past, or at least it appears that it has happened in the past, to my mind. Whether or not it technically has, I'd have staff comment on that. I may be speaking of something that's not real, for lack of a better term.
It may be real. Typically, what you would have in the current process is you would end up running into one of those major triggers, typically, that would go back before the governing body for the approval. So what would happen is the preliminary would be, I'm trying to remember the scenario, so hopefully I get this right. The preliminary would be approved by the Planning Commission, and then it would continue on to the City Commission. The City Commission would go through its process, but there's the process currently laid out would allow the City Commission to amend those without having it all come all the way back to the planning commission. So it's possible that it was amended without coming back as part of that process. And I think I can remember a couple where you're talking about, and I think that may have been ones that were processed under the 1966 code and not necessarily the 2006, because that's part of the issue that we have with the two codes is it's not clear sometimes about which code you use to get back to the starting grid. And that's one of the things that we're clarifying is, and that's one of the Rubik's Cubes that staff has to always undo whenever we have a zoning that comes in with a PCD or a PRD, is we have to go back and understand how did we get to the end product and then recreate the entire process to figure out what is the steps to amend it. And so if you think of those specific zoning districts, they're like small dissertations that staff has to do to even figure out what does the process look like that someone's eligible for. And that's not an insignificant research project sometimes.
Okay. I see. I just wanted to make sure that this sort of change in the uses or the proposal, especially since we've Plan 2040 is calling for mixed use. If those changes were to be made in the final development plan, I would want that to be constituted as a major change.
Sure.
So, but if it's in there, okay.
Either discussion? Okay, if not, just go back to.
I have more notes.
Oh, you had more notes.
But
I'm sorry.
I don't
No,
want
go
to
ahead.
take up all the time. So
Go ahead. It's, yeah. we have
Okay.
time.
So, well, this is where I thought this is what we're going through this, and you asked me to keep it short.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about now. I'm in what is this section? Special uses. I noticed that under special uses, review and decision making. So what we are responsible for the Planning Commission, it says here whether the proposed use will cause substantial diminution in value of other property in the neighborhood in which it is to be located. And that caught my attention because we've spent a lot of time up here talking about how property values don't matter in our decisions, or we're not supposed to consider property values. So I was curious to see that stated.
Is that
under
special
that.
use application? That's under the special use application.
It is under the special use.
Yeah, so that would be my understanding
Okay.
outside the purview of the major code. This is specific to special use. Like, so if we were to say, have an applicant come in with like a special use for the land or their building, we would then say, does that special use provide or cause substantial diminution in value of the property? Whereas, like, if somebody wants to build an ADU in their backyard, by right, they could do that. We can't use that as a basis for, or a single dwelling unit. We can't use that as a basis for our decision-making.
So this isn't a change from what we've been doing.
This is currently in the Land Development Code.
Okay.
I believe it is also in the golden factors.
Okay, just wanted to check. Thank you. No, thank you. That's.
What's the site for that?
This is 20-1604, specific procedures with city commission or BZA decision, section C.
C, thank you.
Okay, let's see. That was floodplain. I'll get answers on that.
Take your time.
So I just have one big comment about enforcement, but that I'll wait till we're through with 16, Article 16.
I mean, just go ahead. Yeah, just go ahead.
Oh, just a general comment, just because I didn't expect to be looking at enforcement tonight, so I don't have any detailed comments on that, but I just want to make a comment more for City Commission ears, is that in talking with people and reading all the letters that have come in to us about this, I mean, one of the main concerns I hear about, particularly in relation to neighborhoods that are near the university, and I've been seeing these comments come through my neighborhood, is the enforcement issue. And I think that this is at the City Commission decision-making level and budgeting possibly, is that right now I see a lack of trust in the city being able being able to enforce, basically through lack of staff and lack of funding. And that's a really big problem for a lot of neighborhoods. If you're talking about unpermitted building, like we saw in one of the pictures today, if we talk about parking administration, one of the limits or the reasons that parking permits are looked upon with suspicion is because if parking isn't enforced now, why would we think that parking is going to be enforced with a new system? Or if certain noise ordinances are not enforced now, why do we think with 3 unrelated people, why do we trust that they're going to be enforced with 4 or 5 people unrelated if that is changed? So I think enforcement is a huge issue for this community. And if the community had a bit more trust in being able to enforce the changes and enforce the existing codes and regulations, I think there would be a little bit more ease in the community about these changes. So I just wanted to make that comment, is that we really need to look at enforcement, and maybe that's a budget issue. I don't know what it is, but I think the City Commission really needs to look into that.
Did you talk about that at our mid-month a little bit as far as enforcement?
I may have, and I just don't remember, but I can add to it if I need to at that point in time. So, you highlighted a couple there, and then you've got noise, which is typically governed by police, parking, which is usually governed by the parking department, which is a bit of a thing. And just so you know, there's no parking that they do outside of the metered areas because they don't have anything to really do. And some of the ones you highlight are code compliance, which is a division inside planning and development services. And so, yeah, we do have a staff of 2 rental license officers and 2 code compliance officers that cover the entire city.
Right.
So there is we do work on a complaint base at this point because we don't have a lot of, I'll be candid, we don't have a lot of staff and resource to that. And so they do work a little bit in more of that complaint-based item. But I will, the other side of that is if you have a building permit or a building going on without that, that's a different set of inspectors than code compliance. That's the building team. And so building inspectors work differently than code compliance inspectors do. So there's a number of different inspectors that you go through, but in the actuality is it's all City of Lawrence at some point. And so we're all trying to make sure we're getting those done as we can. But that is something that would be a budgetary consideration of the City Commission on that question.
Yeah. I'm just making the point because enforcement was up tonight, and I just want to make that to City Commission ears that I think that would go a long way in reassuring the community with these changes.
And I think along the same lines, based on all the emails, the email traffic that we've received, not just so much enforcement is a big part of it, but there's a lot of new in here, and there's a lot of FUD. There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in everybody's minds about the change. How am I going to find out about the change? How's it going to affect me? And it's on all of us, on the City Council or City Commission, to assuage those fears and to let people know that there's, if the changes are made as the way they are now, or if we've changed them before then, there's a reason, and that their concerns need to be taken into account.
Yeah. Let's do. Over here.
That's all I have.
Okay. I just want to go back to that first. Commissioner Thomas, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay. I just want to go back to the first thing and see if there's any, if we want to make any changes. I want to first, Elizabeth, just state what I think the current requirement is and see if I say it correctly. So if it's a site plan, when an application is, even before the application, or when the application is submitted, the applicant reaches out to the neighborhood and informs them. And then 9 days after the application is actually submitted, is it submitted and approved, or submitted is when the 9 days kicks in?
Approved.
Approved. So 9 days after, they have 9 days after the approval of the application to appeal. And we talked about the fact that this is all within the city, so the mail may not be as much of an issue. Is the commission comfortable with stating that as long as we notify the neighborhood at the time the application is being submitted, would that be sufficient? Does that
Moving it to the front side.
moving it to the front side?
That was-
Is
I
the
like
commission?
that idea.
Are you guys happy with that?
But how much, if it's going to be administrative approval only, even if we do it on the day it gets submitted, how many days does it take for it to get approved?
Typically takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get through the approval process.
So it's not approved in a day or two?
No. By the time you get through the completeness review, which is some number of days, and by the time it goes out for the reviewers and reviewers to get comments back to us, that's usually 10 to 14 days from initial on that one. And if there is a revision or a change that needs to be made, that may take the design professional a few days or a week to wrap that up and then get that back for review again. And then we try to review those a little, since there's not as much to review, so review them a little faster. So that can still take up to 5 to 7 days. So it's usually most site plans take somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks to go completely through the process.
That seems sufficient.
So you're saying that the notice would go to the neighbors immediately after the application is submitted?
Correct.
But when it's approved, then is there an appeal process?
Yeah, they have 9 days.
Okay. I'm not comfortable with 9 days, but I certainly think that it's appropriate to do the pre-meeting. I think that may cut down on the need for any kind of appeal if it's done well.
Yeah.
How is the notification done?
Currently, what we do is based on the notice that gets sent out when a site plan is submitted. So if a site plan is submitted to planning, what they do is they send notice out to 400 feet and the neighborhood associations that are within that 400 feet. So if there's 3 neighborhood associations, we send it to all 3 neighborhood associations and anyone within 400 feet. Typically, what will happen is somebody will give us a call or will stop by and want to know more details. And when the planners talk with them, they say, hey, if you're interested, stay in touch. We can let you know when the site plan goes to the administrative process. And what we'll do is we always will typically email out, the site plan has been approved, here is the details related to it. And then that usually is when somebody wants to appeal, they will respond back via email as part of that process.
So it isn't snail mail?
No.
Okay.
And most times, it's quite truthfully, it's both an email and a phone call because somebody will email and also call us at the same time. So there's usually pretty good communication throughout the process between the planner, who's usually shepherding the case through, and anybody that's interested in it.
So the original notice is snail mail, but for appeal purposes, it's email?
We accept email as part of the notification. This has to be a written item back to us so we can record it. And we've done email previously, and most people tend to prefer email.
Okay, I'm thinking worst case here. So let's say, and this wouldn't happen all that often, but I could see it happening. So we notice when something gets submitted. And somebody that lives around that got the notice says, hey, I'm concerned, I want to be involved, please let me know once it's approved. If we're at 9 days, let's say they're on vacation, and most vacations tend to be 7 days at least, and they want to disconnect and they don't check their email for 7 or 8 or 9 days. Are they screwed at that point?
Possibly, yes. Because if we don't receive it within the 9 days, then that would be the issue on that.
But I also think this is part of the value of the early engagement, is that people can be aware and they can make plans and other contingencies around that.
But I don't think that changes the amount of notice time. I think it perhaps changes the fact we've got any conflict. So that the notice time really becomes pretty irrelevant because everybody knows what's happening and they've worked out any issues. And I think the fact that the neighborhoods have asked for 30 days is important.
I'm sorry, Jane.
I understand the argument that that's a long time, but it's really, if we've got 9 days now and they want 30, I think somehow we ought to be able to compromise with 21 or some such other number of days.
Remember, we're talking about 2 different things, though, with site plan and an administrative adjustment. So they're 2 different
I'm just
timelines.
talking about site, I thought we were just talking about site plan right now. So that's all I was talking about.
Go ahead, Commissioner Rexroth. Go ahead.
That the amount of time is not relevant. That's really not accurate, at least in my opinion, because this isn't just about this one thing. This is every application, whether there's an appeal or not. So this decision will affect every single application. It'll slow the process down by our rules on every single one. So I think that's important as well for us to consider. It's not about protecting developers, but it's about these individual homeowners, these individual people out there that are trying to get something through and adding time and cost to them. I don't want to cut public notification out, but I honestly believe by doing this brand new thing of early notification, it gets us there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Considering the time it takes to get through the site plan approval already at 4 to 6 weeks, the early notification plus the 9 days at the end should be plenty.
Yeah, I agree. And Jeff, how do you get our email? How does that work? Like, is the planner asking for the email? Is it something that you guys ask for when the planner's meeting with the neighborhood or something?
Yeah, we usually ask, if you'd like to stay in touch. So we, ask for an email. Sometimes people prefer phone. They give us a phone number instead. But usually when we have those conversations is, would you like to stay in touch, or do you have any follow-up questions? And sometimes people go, no, I'm good, and I've got my questions, and I'm, that was it, and I don't have any interest. Sometimes people are like, yes, I would love to be in touch. I might want to follow on with that one. So it's really the personal preference of people. And so we always ask for that, or if somebody wants to be notified. It's just one of the ways we always try to make sure that we're keeping in touch with everybody throughout the process.
Thank you. So I agree with Commissioner Crawford that the early notification gets to where we want to get. So I don't know if any other people on the commission have thoughts or concerns.
I concur.
As do I.
Okay. We don't vote, so I guess you can.
The last thing I'll say on that, like if you do the basic math, if there are 4 to 6 appeals on 200,
300.
I'm going low.
You're going low, yeah,
Math
exactly.
even look better.
Yeah.
You're between 2 and 4%.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Total max of
Right.
appeals. Now, again, I know we're changing stuff, and there could be some additional appeals concern, that the public would raise, but I don't see the need for a huge shift in it if we're willing to notice on the front end. That was my logic behind it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. All right, guys, we're at 9 o'clock. Anybody else have anything we want to talk about, or do we want to get home in time for dinner or late dinner? Anything else? If not, I'm going to adjourn the meeting.
Well,
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Point of order, you still have miscellaneous new or old business
Oh.
ahead of adjournment.
Okay.
Oh, what?
What did I miss? So is this just a matter of asking if there's any?
Yeah, I will say staff doesn't have any, but I don't know if any commissioners have. any.
Do any commissioners have any other business that we should consider? Anything? No? Okay. I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. We have to vote on it, right?
To adjourn?
Can I ask
Oh,
real
please,
quickly
please,
to make
please,
sure that
please.
Elizabeth has
Oh,
what
yes.
she needs?
That's a good, sorry.
From our discussion?
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. And I will share it back in written form with you guys at the next meeting, so you can see and make sure that I captured it correctly.
Perfect.
And if all else fails, I'll re-listen to the hearing for a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, just.
Nope, I appreciate it.
Yeah. And anybody make a motion to adjourn? Okay.
Second.
Second. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt.